Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com.
Today's warehouse needs to keep inventory moving smoothly and quickly. Meet these challenges with on-demand warehouse labeling from Brother Mobile Solutions. Our mobile and industrial printers will help optimize your operations to achieve the speed, reliability, and durability your warehouse needs. With easy integration for existing warehouse technology, convenient portability, and upfront affordability, Brother Mobile Solutions is at your side when it comes to warehouse labeling. Try one for free today by visiting brothermobilesolutions.com/new warehouse or click the link in the show notes. That's brothermobilesolutions.com/new warehouse to try one for free today.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. Today's episode, I am going to be joined by Ryan Chesterfield. He is the founder of AutoFC, which is an automation consulting company that he just recently started. And he's been on the show previously as well from some of his other experiences and background, which we'll talk about a little bit. And we'll talk a little bit about what's behind AutoFC and what hole he kind of thought was in the market here. And we'll get a little bit into automation projects, what maybe he sees coming up, and also how to avoid some failures in automation projects as well, which I think is going to have a lot of great, interesting tips there. So, Ryan, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, Kevin. Thanks so much for having me.
Definitely happy to have you on again. I think this is maybe your second time on the show, right?
It is even actually third, because we did a recording and then we met at Modex for sort of a secondary follow-up situation. So that just popped in my head. But yeah, call it second official time.
Okay. Either way, we're happy to have you back on again to the show, and this time to talk about something a little different than in the past, because you started this new company. So, but before we kind of dive into your new company and stuff, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and why you kind of decided to go in this direction? What led you to this point?
Well, I was a mechanical engineer in college. Mm-hmm. I always knew that's what I wanted to do. Never changed my major, only applied to one school, one major, that kind of thing. I saw lots of my peers that was sort of a process for them. Mm-hmm. But I was, taking the go-kart apart in the garage at 12 years old, that kind of thing. Okay. So I always had mechanical curiosity. And in college, I started interning for a company that was installing conveyor systems in warehouses. And, I would come to find out this was the sort of first form of, warehouse automation I would be exposed to, which would kind of end up being my career. But yeah, I really started my career in college installing conveyor systems. So I'd be boots on the ground working with mechanical and electrical crews to install this equipment, install, other steel structures, things like that, crawling around on the ground, as an intern for this. I remember one job my job was to go through and lock tight all of the photo brackets. And there was, hundreds of these photo brackets. And so, got my hands dirty, so to speak, and literally. And that was my exposure to that world. And then shortly after that, started selling these systems. Mm-hmm. And that's where I went to, move to understand the customer a little bit more as an engineer and crawling around on the ground. I understood what it is that I was looking at. And then in sales, you more understood the purpose of what all this steel was supposed to do, for the customer. And then in, and furthering it in sales, you had to understand why it is that they're buying this thing. What value does it provide them? And that's where I really cut my teeth in career, was selling automated systems. So from this company, I went to another company, a major player in the industry, and they were an OEM. So they manufactured all the solutions that they put in and supported these solutions, right? Which turns out to be really key, is the ability to fix it when it breaks.
Right.
But again, that's where, I came to understand the warehousing industry, the different models of retail fulfillment, grocery, frozen, things like that. There's sort of all these different verticals within supply chain that a lot of them share some of the same problems, and the problems between the different verticals can vary quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these industries are looking at the same solutions, which is sort of interesting and sort of takes me to where I am today. But yeah, I mean, really my background working for these different companies in industrial automation and working with the customers to, at the time I'm selling the solution. And so one of the holes that I saw was everything's a nail when you're a hammer. As the salesperson, you're trying to fill the hole with the solution that you're in charge of, or the solution that you're going to be paid from. And so, that doesn't allow your visibility to be optimal for the customer's best interests, right? You're going in there and you're doing the best you can as the liaison for the company and even as the customer, right? I don't want to make it sound like vendors are trying to mislead people, but they only have so many hours in the day to spend with you and to understand business. And they're throwing this over the fence to, the folks that are designing these systems. And it is no trivial task to design a $10 million automated conveyor system, right? There's many, many inputs that must be understood and assumed. And that's really the hole that I saw was, bad data. I had, it didn't matter what system I installed, the customer never loved it for the first couple months. And sometimes they never ended up loving it. Yeah. That's because, everybody learns about all the things you didn't think about when you actually install this into a live environment. And so, you heard the term, bad info in, bad info out, crap in, crap out, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. The customers don't have the ability today to also communicate to these complex automated vendors their business, right? These are warehouse folks that are maybe understand how things move about in their facility, but they don't necessarily understand how, if they change one of those numbers by a digit or two, what that can do to a very rigid automated system. And that's where I saw improvement, really. And there's this function is out there today. There's lots of companies out there today that will consult for you on your automated system and put you in touch with the vendors. But one of the skill sets that I hope will differentiate, myself or us as we grow is really leaning on data analytics and simulation to be the core of the consultation. And what I mean by that is using software tools, really, and data analytics. There's some numerous tools out there, and also simulation, right? So we analyze the data to get a profile of the business, and then we plug in these inputs into a simulation. FlexSim is a simulation software that I'm sinking my teeth into, and I've got a partner, so we're kind of going after this. And this is being done today for the highly complex systems there are. I remember selling them, right? If it got so complex, you couldn't bolt it to the ground unless it was simulated, because, mistakes would be very costly. But even at the major players, these resources are constrained. There's only one or two people that can do this. Even if there's a couple, they can only work on a very small percentage of the projects. And I think this is a miss. And I also think this software has come down in price and cost, and really is closer to people like me to be able to utilize. I mean, I've seen it. I've dabbled with it. Yeah. I think this could differentiate, right? We would lean on data analytics and simulation the recommendation, and then using the industry knowledge, right? I've seen bolted to the ground all this technology. You can quickly say whether this makes sense, that doesn't make sense. Are you talking about a new building, old building? Old building? Okay, well, let's not even talk about the 60% of solutions that are there.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a long string of the background, but I think that's the gap out there today, is that the information flowing between the people using this technology and the people making this technology improved. And I think there's tools out there that can be more widespread used to accomplish this.
Very interesting. And I love the fact that you're touching on the point of, ensuring that the data is good, or even, drawing from your experiences where data has been bad and the customer ends up not liking the solution, right? I think that's such an important thing, because it takes a lot of pre-work in order to ensure that you have a successful solution implementation in some way. But I'm curious your thoughts on, because you mentioned there, as a salesperson, you really only have, the ability to offer what your company offers, right? So, sometimes maybe it's not the best fit for the customer. That's like in the overall marketplace available. And I think that, a couple of years ago, I was certainly seeing where, certain companies were coming out with automation solutions or robotic solutions that were very geared to like just one part of the operation, or like specific operations only, and kind of, limiting themselves a little bit to the potential customers. But, we've certainly seen where these robotics companies have, like, for example, like Locust Robotics, right? So they had like just the Locust bot, which is very targeted to like smaller objects in a sense, e-commerce solution. But then they went and acquired like Waypoint Robotics, right? So they can have bigger payloads. So I'm curious, what do you think about those types of things happening in the automation robotics marketplace? And do you think more of that is going to be happening as customers realize like they need a wider assortment of automation solutions and options?
Yeah, interesting scenario, because I'm kind of looking at it from two different perspectives, bringing the hammer and the nail back to that analogy, back to the forefront here. So from, you mentioned Lois and, the small stuff, and then the ability to move to larger stuff. The economics of the solution is what drives the second sale, right? So let's say you can assume that anybody can get in there and sell one or a couple of the first building, whatnot.
Yeah.
The second and the third and the fourth are going to be driven by how advantageous the economics end up being, right? Sometimes it's not always fair, because the customers aren't always good at this. You got a bunch of people playing soccer. You're getting a hockey stick and telling them they got to play hockey now. The rules change, the functions change, and so it takes them a minute to get going. That was the difficult part about a salesperson, was, when the customer had challenges adopting and couldn't produce the numbers, you say they should, to drive that second sale. But I'll kind of jump to those two solutions you talked about, the small stuff and the large stuff. For the large stuff, one thing I found was the return on investment is very different than a fulfillment solution, right? Those two solutions mechanically are very similar. They got wheels, they got a body, they got some navigation and support, tell them where to go. But carrying a tote through a picking process and carrying a pallet from A to B is a totally different business case. And, the fact that unit, I believe, you have to set a pallet on top of that unit, right? Require a person to do that. So even though if we can carry it from A to B all day, if you've got a huge building and just super high volume, you maybe have a business case. But the fact that somebody has to set it on there and also take it off, we've actually added touches to the process. So there's, certainly possibility. It totally depends on the customer and the application. may be damaging the return on investment if it's a short run for a solution like that. So that's where, just the fulfillment makes sense in that case, not that. But that might be a situation where customer may say, well, it worked for us here. These guys are great. We like working for it. It could work for us over here. There may be other dollars that could attack some lower hanging fruit. And that fruit may not be low hanging at all.
Step, step, step. Do you know how many steps your warehouse workers are taking a day? When your workers are walking, you're losing money. Endless trips to the printer or computer add up fast. Newcastle's mobile industrial carts with integrated power eliminate the walking to stationary printers and computers, keeping workers focused on high-value tasks, often doubling their output. Thousands of powered cart installations, including ones at the new warehouse's own micro-fulfillment center and in my previous jobs, prove that Newcastle customers get more done and save money. To learn more, head to newcastlesys.com. That's newcastlesys.com. Yeah, interesting perspective. And I guess, it's I think when people think about going into automation and things like that, I feel like, right off the bat, like they're thinking about almost like the dark warehouse type of scenario, right? But it's interesting that you point out, like, there's probably just certain pockets maybe of your operation at your current state that really makes sense and will give you that return to automate. I guess with that being said, if we look at the landscape of automation and businesses and right now, where do you think, and obviously we know, the big guys like Amazon and stuff, we know where they are with robotics, right? They're just making their own solutions basically. But more like, in the medium kind of size businesses to smaller businesses. I mean, realistically, like, because we've been saying for a long time, I think in the industry, and especially with, Modex last year, like all this talk about labor shortage, that, automation is no longer like necessarily a nice to have. It's sort of a necessity to continue to grow and go into the future. But realistically, I mean, where do you think businesses are like on average in their automation journey?
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One I consider myself all the time, right? As I'm going into these customers, selling this equipment. I mean, the first thing you're trying to do is figure out who is this guy like, right? And you can tell by going in, if you look around and there's dust on everything, right? And you're selling this super high cost, fancy robot, and you just go around, you can tell, I mean, what customers are going to be interested in and whatnot. But I read a statistic from a publication the other day that less 18% of warehouses have some form of mechanization. And that's what some people would lump automation into that, right? A piece of equipment sort of, moving something around for them, conveyor or stretch wrapper, things like that, automated packaging machine. And I found this, I kind of mentioned earlier, I would go into customers very often, be looking at a high-end robot, let's call it, and they're still picking from paper. And, if I were consulting for a customer, I would be telling them, like, look, if you're picking from paper, like you've got, you've got some software that can help organize work. That will save you more in labor than this system. And the reality is there's an order of operations to technology in the warehouse. If you don't have the foundation laid, all these fancy robots are going to collect all this data that you don't have anything to do with or have no way to make good use of. So that's where, I would go into customers and kind of know quickly on some systems they were using that this wasn't going to be a good opportunity for me because they were so far behind. And that just indicates that people are out there looking for solutions, right? Their boss is saying, hey, our bottom line fell out last year because of labor. Go out there and find solutions. So they're out there Googling, warehouse solutions, whatever it is they can find, calling these vendors to come in and help them. And it's exactly, that's how else would they know what to do? I mean, that's what I'm doing when I'm trying to learn how to do something.
Yeah.
And that's where I kind of mentioned earlier, I think the information can be improved because there's, lots of things that really quick aren't going to make this at all if you're not talking about a new building, for example, or, a larger building, things like that. So I think most folks are infant in their automation journey. I think it's a very confusing world out there, right? You were at Modex, you're from that this year. I'm sure I'll see you there.
Yes.
There's everybody and their mother's got a new widget that does something cool in the warehouse or moves something around on some vision system, right? And so I imagine it's pretty confusing for somebody that's boss is saying, hey, out there and find us, a solution for our next warehouse. Like, how would you know where to start? And ask you that, as an operator, how do you try to see through the weeds on what's real and what's just happening in a demo room?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, and I guess before I answer, I certainly, love your point about going in and seeing, people picking on paper, asking about automation solutions. There's earlier, I think, problems to address there. I would agree with you. But yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like trying to figure out, what's really like a viable solution or something that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think you have to weigh kind of I think it's, you look at your business perspective and like, where are you? I mean, for me and like my operation, I'm very small right now, right? So I know, like, for me, like to invest in automation in 2,700 square foot space or anything like that is, doesn't make sense like at this time, right? But if I call back to like my previous job where I was working for another company, and we started to look at AMRs potentially, right? Like one of the challenges, honestly, I think, was figuring out what part of our processes where we could get the mindsets of some of the, I guess you would say, like old school people that were working in there to understand why we could potentially see some type of gain from introducing that, when, the mindset was sort of like, we've been doing things this way for so many years and it works fine. Why would we look at this differently, right? So that was kind of the way that I approached it, was thinking like, and mind you, I have the podcast, so I'm very much aware of like all the solutions that are out there, right? Mm-hmm. So it was kind of like thinking about, okay, which one would make the most sense that like isn't necessarily like overly complicated and would require, a bunch of, it's sort of infrastructure change, and keeping in mind too that our WMS was like super, super old, and how could we do something that maybe required very little integration, which, the IT group was very like resistant to. So, trying to keep that in mind and understand, like thinking of that. And so, we landed on looking at some mere AMRs for basically easy pallet movement from like our manufacturing area to like our shipping dock area, like stuff that was done, manufactured, like, okay, needs to get over to the shipping dock because it's got to go on the UPS truck or something, right? So that's where we ended up like kind of looking and kind of tackling that, because, it was easy to prove out like, hey, we're keeping like an extra headcount or two just to basically move these things around, right? And we were struggling to find more skilled labor to work in the manufacturing department, which these people that we were keeping to move stuff around, they knew how to build product, they knew how to manufacture, but we still needed to keep them to move product around, right? So it was kind of like the balance of where's the value more? Like the value's more on the side of them being in the work cell, building product, than it is shuttling pallets and carts around, right? So that's really kind of like the approach that I took, was like, how do we like dip our toes in the water first as like a company, and understanding the culture of the company and where people could find like that little bit of acceptance to start the journey, I think. And I would say like that was the approach for me, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. And I love the upping the utilization of the value added labor, right? Their value is in doing that, manufacturing process, or that value add, not in walking with a pallet jack. Right. So, on paper, smells like a great application. Can you tell us anything about the output or hindsight? Like,
yeah, well, so we were kind of in the process of testing some different solutions, doing some on-site demos. We were doing, I think it was a mere 250, I want to say, we were playing around with, and we had to make some adjustments a little bit, but I ended up leaving and starting my own thing before like that came to closure. So I'm not sure where necessarily they ended up, but that was like the route we were going down. And yeah, I mean, it made total sense if we could find the right solution just to shuttle those pallets, because we were looking at, so basically like for the manufacturing side of things, we have manufacturing distribution under one roof, and we'd have pickers. They would pick all the components onto these carts, which would get wheeled around into work cells. And the carts, so we were trying to find a solution where we could have the carts moved from the work cell. And so basically like they would take the components off the carts, build, and then the output would go onto a pallet. So it was like we were trying to find one for the front end, like how do we move the carts out of staging to the work cell to the operator? And then how do we take their finished product and move it to, the proper location for shipping, right? So that's kind of what we were doing. And that seemed to make the most sense, I would say, from a initial automation perspective. I think like at the time, like my boss was really like we did like a lot of floor loaded container unloading there. Which was, always difficult to maintain labor for, because it's just very hard work, right? And it's
brutal, yeah.
Yeah, and now at the time, like, he was like, how do we automate this? How do we automate this? How do we automate this? And, at the time, it was nothing really out there for automation on that. I mean, now, like, there's some things coming out, like Boston Dynamics has the Stretch, and I think Honeywell has something too as well that's coming out. But yeah, I mean, it was like trying to, convince them, let's do something like a little more simple first before, we try to like dive into something that's like very, very new technology, essentially. So yeah, it's pretty interesting conversations and a little bit of convincing going on too.
I can only imagine. I mean, the old school train of thought, like however you described it, is a real challenge, right? That's certainly one of the things that causes automation projects to fail is that adoption is never fully accepted by the operation. If you, as even the vendor, can't influence the champion on the other side to really own this, I mean, there's wins that these vendors face that aren't their own fault. They're just personal. You could just have a certain personality type that's driving the ship over there, and depending on where they feel like steering, that can influence outcome, which I mean, I would argue is caused automated projects to not get a fair shake in many cases. But also, like you mentioned, the trailer thing, right? This is like, I don't want to call it the holy grail of warehouse automation, but it seems to be this, it's the one that's been eluding, everybody, right? We got all the variances, different trucks, different floors of the trucks. But, even a product like Stretch, right? This robot, will unload individual cases, floor load on a container, right? That's what it does.
Right. Yeah.
So without this massive conveyor system on the back end of Stretch, how do you even use it? Like if you don't have a $5 million conveyor system to sort and scan and capture all these cases you just unloaded with the robot, like what good is that?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of like, I think that's was part of the thing too, is like, I knew like, we don't have, we had probably, I don't know, 30, 40 feet of conveyor in the building. So it was not like, we had this like robust automation already set up and like, let's add some robots to it to, the in-betweens and stuff like that. It was nothing like that. So it was like, we're very like fresh in starting this journey. Basically starting, from the beginning of how do we get more automation in here and going for a project like that.
What hurts, huge. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like this is where, thing, and right? That's the first question I would ask the customer, right? Is where does it hurt? And honestly, look back, like I know maybe that really isn't the right question. I certainly want to know where it hurts, but the customer is going to tell you their perspective is going to be it's in a different context than yours as the solution provider. Just because it hurts, maybe we want to solve that, maybe we don't, right? Like unload trailer would be an example. Yeah. So it's a jungle out there, Kevin. And it only seems to be growing, right? I post a lot of it, but you can find a million articles out there that X billions of dollars is going to be spent in supply chain. And it makes sense to me. In my years of selling it, I only heard it increase, that labor is a problem. We can't keep our people. Amazon builds a facility, steals all of our people. The competition is rising. And I suspect that, these warehouse workers, we mentioned earlier, it's brutal unloading a trailer. Nobody wants to work in a warehouse anymore. So if you're not arming your labor force with some tools to make their job easier, ergonomic, and more safe, I think they're going to go work somewhere else. Because you kind of mentioned it earlier, it's becoming more of a have to have than a nice to have. Yeah. And it's only going to get worse.
Yeah. I think I agree with you. And I think it's something that companies need to start to figure out. And, hopefully guys like you can come in and, help them to understand what they actually need to do to go along with that journey instead of, going with the, like you mentioned the situation where, still picking on paper, but, the boss said we need to do something about the labor. And so they're trying to figure out automation, right? Whereas, probably if you got off picking with paper, you'd probably have productivity gains right there off the bat, right? Yeah, I think very interesting stuff talking to you here, Ryan, and I'm sure we'll be talking again about more automation stuff in the future. But if people are interested in trying to get in touch with you now with the new business Auto FC and learning more about your services you're offering, how can they do that?
Yeah, contact me on the web, autofc.com, or you can reach me at contact@autofc.com.
All right, awesome. And we'll put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well. So, Ryan, thank you again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.